Professor Evans joins us today as part of the Consortium on Collaborative Governance Faculty Exchange Program. So the spirit of the exchange program is for the faculties in the 3 schools, in Washington, Arizona, and USC, to get to know each other and exchange ideas. And earlier today, I understand that Laura has talked to some of our doctoral students, and it's been very helpful in terms of our students being able to learn from faculty from other schools. So Laura is going to talk about government to government, understanding state-indigenous relations. My understanding is she's not limiting her talk about experience in the US, but also will provide us with some comparative experience in other countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. So when Nora give the talk, and I think she doesn't mind if you ask questions for clarification, and I look forward to a very stimulating talk. Welcome, Nora.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here. I'm absolutely willing to take questions as we go, and I'll try to monitor the time and let you know if I think we're behind pace a little bit. Part of why I'm excited to be here today is I want to pick your brain about some questions that have been puzzling me for a while and that I think my body of work provides some indications about, and I think are questions we should reflect on, but ones for which we don't have the answers fully worked out yet. And so that what I want to talk today is actually grounded in an idea that has been in my mind and I've been puzzling over and turning over for a long time, is this idea that for American Indian tribal governments, there might be an explicit and unfortunate trade-off between effective governance and effective government. And so the quote here is from the treasurer of the National Congress of American Indians, who remarked, "One of the primary objectives that we should request is a better government-to-government mechanism for the federal-tribal relationship. Whether they take any of our initiatives or not, they won't work effectively unless the government-to-government mechanism is firmly in place." The treasurer goes on to be clear that even for some concrete, more tangible policy initiatives that might involve cooperative relationships, it's worthwhile to hold off on those and maybe even sacrifice some of those to get a commitment to this more abstract idea of a government-to-government mechanism and framework and set of priorities. And so the question I have is, what do we make of this? That there are experienced, knowledgeable tribal leaders, and some of which see a trade-off between being able to exercise government and then being able to participate in governance partnerships. And what are the implications of that concern that they have? I think our first question is, are in fact they doing too much to sacrifice the tangible for the symbolic? So forms of collaborative governance can be very focused and applied on delivering certain benefits, addressing certain problems. The ideas of government and government relationships are more abstract and are these frameworks that don't necessarily have immediate consequences. And so the question is that valuing the symbolic over the tangible, or is it that government-to-government relations are a necessary foundation for collaborative governance? This is a question that I have found in a variety of things I've written, and I think those works give us some tools to start to work through that puzzle. And so rather than presenting a piece of one of these works, I want to talk about themes and findings and implications across them. The most recent of these is a piece on tribal state relations in the Anglosphere that is with the Annual Review of Political Science, which was the time I was really prompted to think about these international comparisons. My prior work has been about the US, so certainly more of my expertise is as US-centered. But the Annual Review was a great opportunity to really think hard about these international comparisons, especially being Anglosphere, meaning Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Before I get started too far, since I'm talking about the difference between government and governance, I need to define what I mean by those terms in this particular context. And what I would suggest is that by government, I'm talking about powers of sovereignty, akin to the powers of sovereignty exercised by the federal government or by state governments. So what does sovereignty mean? It means exclusive, inherent, and enduring powers. Even if those are unlimited domains, within those domains, there are exclusive, inherent, and enduring powers. So there we have a framework of authority. And then governance would fit more into what a lot of folks would call self-determination, which is the power to engage in assessments of needs, and then the power to serve those needs. So much more a domain of things that are immediately actionable. And so these are things that aren't necessarily in competition. It's possible to have both, and at the same time they are separate things, and that you might have circumstances where there is a trade-off between doing more to bolster lived self-determination and doing more to bolster support for this idea of sovereignty, which is more abstract. So those are the definitions I'm going to be having in mind when I think about government versus governance in this particular case. Before I go too far, I should take a little time to talk about what's an American Indian tribal government and provide some context here. I will start with the observation that California is weird. I say that with great affection. I grew up in California. My folks and my sister are still here. But in terms of talking about the national status and circumstances of American Indian tribal governments, California is kind of unusual, shall we say. So I'm not going to say a lot that's California specific. I think you've probably had experiences and observations that can be insightful, but I might at a certain point say return to the California is weird observation and focus more on the national piece. I'm going to say later about how I think California is very useful for some hypothesis testing, but for descriptives it's its own beast. So there are 565, actually I pasted this from an old slide, it is now 566 federally recognized American Indian tribal governments in the United States. They are in 37 states, which include the nation's largest states, and in all of the states west of the Mississippi River. Okay, so what are these governments all about? So I think the first thing to stress is that American Indian tribal governments are governments. They are sovereign governments with recognized land bases and with powers recognized in treaty and in statutes. And so the basic framework around treaties is that in treaty arrangements, tribal governments gave up certain expressly stated powers and retained all others. So as a result, much of the sovereign power that any government would exercise endure over time with selective compromises and selective surrendering of rights that resulted from a treaty process. So sovereign with powers that are constrained by express statements in treaties. Another part of this, and we see this articulated since going back to John Marshall's decisions in the 1830s, and then in subsequent Supreme Court decisions over time, is the idea that because there is this constrained sovereignty, it naturally results in a trust relationship with the federal government and a trust responsibility for the federal government. So a government that has constraints on its sovereignty, as a result, has constraints on its ability to meet the needs of its people. So in making agreements that demand of tribal governments that they surrender certain powers, the federal government inherently takes on responsibility of making sure that the members of tribal nations have their needs met and are fully served. Basic idea that if you're going to fully provide for your own needs, you need this full sovereignty and full independence. Once you sacrifice that, contained in that is a trust responsibility for the federal government. And of course, all this, so these are legal principles we see in treaties, we see in Supreme Court decisions, and I think we all know that what statute and case law say can be different from the realpolitik. And so certainly what we have seen over time is that in lived experience, the power of American Indian tribal governments has been determined by lived power in other domains. And when tribal governments have had fewer economic resources, less political power, less political savvy, in fact, many of these rights have been abrogated and overlooked. But that's the starting legal framework, even if it's not a lived experience in a lot of places. I should stop here and just see if there are any questions about this basic thing of what a tribal government is. Yes?
Well, I was going to withhold my question, but since you...
No, I think it's important, yeah.
Stop pausing, I will jump in. I'm just, as you were describing that, I was wondering about the, what were these sort of quasi-sovereign homelands in South Africa during the apartheid era? I mean, as a kind of a legal relationship, are there any similarities or parallels? Has anyone drawn upon those?
I think people have, and I haven't read it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know how that's comparable. Partly there are these different legal traditions that come out. I mean, it's not just the original treaties, but also a set of Supreme Court decisions starting in the 1830s. Yeah.
You know, we talk about these as sovereign governments, et cetera. On the other hand, you know, there's one part of me that says, well, get real, right? I mean, how sovereign are they? They're these enclaves that are completely surrounded and completely subordinate to, you know, a much more powerful government. And there's, you know, they're a separate ethnic group that were sort of. There's certainly a narrative to suggest that, you know, that they were at war with and, you know, were subjugated by, and so there are some at least superficial parallels, but I don't know whether. You know, whether those are reflected in any parallel sort of legal structures, et cetera.
Yeah, I don't know. The two pieces that would be the key moving parts are, is it a question of the only powers sacrificed are expressly stated powers in the treaty process, so all other powers are retained and enduring, at least in legal principle, and the idea of the other side of the trust relationship, that because of that sacrifice of powers, the federal government has a heightened responsibility. And so those are the two pieces that it would be super interesting to see what those parallels are. Yeah?
Let me ask you a question about the matter of sovereignty. I keep thinking about the famous Max Weber formulation of sovereignty, or what a state is, and that is monopoly over the use of violence, force. Not sure which word to use, but in any case, tribal governments don't have armies, they do have police forces. But I really wonder to what degree you can talk about sovereignty in a true sense if you're willing to use that criterion.
It's interesting. I mean, so state governments in the U.S. are sovereign, and they don't have, I mean, they have organizations that certainly people can carry big guns around, but can't declare war on particular actors. So I think that, right, so that control of the use of force, I mean, there is that element of policing, which is no small matter. But yeah, I think that, I mean, I think as we think about the sovereigns located within the United States, all of those sovereigns to a degree none is in a position to declare war, for example, or exercise full military power. I think it's this interesting piece too, then it's sovereignty within certain domains. So it is exclusive, inherent, enduring power, but it's in particular domains. So for example, it's not in the domain of foreign policy. Yeah?
Not to be greedy, but just another quick question. I mean, is the term American Indian, is that a contested term at all?
Yeah, it's a good question. People use American Indian, people use Native American, people use the term of Native nations. I don't think necessarily these are contested. They're just things in different use. So I tend to use American Indian simply because it's the terminology in a lot of enduring legal arrangements and enduring organizations over time.
I think call themselves in these.
Well, I think anybody will ask you they'd like to be called Navajo or Sioux or Hopi or Snohomish, or I mean, I think in some ways it's this artificial category of talking about tribes as this national phenomenon. So I think for the most part in work you do, you want to talk about Navajo or the Hopi or the Puyallup or the Paiute. That's, I think, always the preferable language to use. I think different people use American Indian, Native American. American Indian continues to be what the Census Bureau uses and what OMB dictates as the official federal term, but you see the federal government has the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it has the Administration for Native Americans. I think, I don't think there's necessarily a controversy. I think that, I think both are valid and commonly used. Yeah.
I want to make a comparison because I come from Mexico. And in Mexico we have a lot of indigenous communities, and they have also, well, there are some laws, rules that apply just to them. And officially, they have the power to control their territory. In the real world, that doesn't work. So they don't have representatives in the Senate or the Chamber of Representatives. And when it comes to talk about using the resources in the areas, well, they almost have no work. They cannot decide about that. So it's more all this government and governance work nominal than real. How does that work?
Yeah, so again, Mexico's a case I don't know well. I know a tiny bit about. I think part of what's different in Mexico is some of that realpolitik. Also, it is in the legal framework of not having the kind of sovereignty that tribal governments in the United States and elsewhere in the Anglosphere possess. I mean, it starts with this difference between the Spanish and British legal traditions that got many of these systems unfolding. Yeah, I think the Mexican case is terribly interesting. I don't know a lot about, and it's both this actual power and this legal principle, and I'm not quite sure how the two interplay.
Yeah, so maybe we're going to talk about this. I think in what Romero was saying is, how much of it is actual, real, formal versus just, is it just no?
Yes. I think that's the question of this is the starting point of the legal principle, and then as we look at the lived experience, I think this is why this piece of, governments, of doing and acting is terribly important. You have to have this piece of being able to make judgments and do something about those judgments. And so government without that piece of governance is pretty hollow. I mean, is completely hollow at its extreme. That there has to be some sort of exercise of power. Yeah.
I have to leave, so I was going to say my question as well. In the United States, all the states have the same legal relationship to the federal government as every other state. That's not true in other countries. For example, in Britain, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland are all states of Britain, but they all have different legal relationships to the central government. So I have a two-part question. One is, are all the tribes in the same legal relationship to the federal government, or do they vary by tribe? So is it like the states, or is it something different? And what makes it a national treaty in some sense? How does it differ from a state relationship? Because if you just look at the statements here, you could apply this to states.
Absolutely.
This describes states as well as.
Absolutely.
So I would like a little more clarity on the difference between a state relative to a federal government and a national sovereign nation relative, and are they uniform or not? Especially, I know the states are uniform, but the tribes are.
Yeah, and I think definitely the status of tribal governments is very much comparable to that of state governments. They are sovereign entities within the United States. So not like local governments and county governments, which are the creatures of the state and don't hold sovereign powers, but that feature of states themselves that have certain inherent and exclusive powers. I think that, so there are some overarching legal frameworks, and then there is variation that comes from the particular arrangements of treaties. So an experience that's common, that has been an issue in the Pacific Northwest and also the Great Lakes, is that treaties provided for access to usual and accustomed areas of hunting and fishing. And so as a result, there have been forms of sovereign authority that extend off of reservation land bases and into areas of traditional fishing and hunting. And in other places, that sort of language is not contained in treaties. There also have been, for a variety of reasons, in California, the state of California has certain regulatory powers relative to tribal governments. This is something outside of gaming, but issues of policing in particular. So there are a basic legal structure and then differences that have emerged from both explicit and implicit features of treaty relationships. So yeah, it's why the, generalizing about any 566 places is inherently fraught with some broad brushstrokes. I'm going to go ahead and talk a bit about understanding the nature of disparities that we see on Indian lands, and this is using the data from the American Community Survey 2006 to 2010, looking first at, as we look at American Indians and Alaska Natives, looking at populations that live on reservations, and then the entire population of American Indians and Alaska Natives compared to the US population. And we see some pretty sobering numbers, unemployment rates of 16% on reservations, 14% overall for American Indians and Alaska Natives, and 5% for the United States as a whole. Per capita income, $13,000 on reservations, $17,000 for American Indians and Alaska Natives overall, and $27,000 for the US population. And as one would expect by those unemployment and income numbers, poverty rates are much higher on reservations and for American Indians and Alaska Natives as in general. We can see parallels to this in health outcomes, educational attainment, and also physical infrastructure of living circumstances, quality of housing stock. So I think we have to start with this understanding of these deep social economic disparities that exist on reservations and for American Indians and Alaska Natives as a general matter. I do want to say a little bit about gaming, that casinos have transformed some tribal lands, but not most. So the basic story is that about 1/2 of federally recognized tribal governments have casinos, and that casino success is highly concentrated. Much of that concentration is happening in California, obviously. So about 1/7 of casinos generate 2/3 of the revenue. And by saying 1/7, that's a count of casinos. So many tribes with highly profitable casinos have multiple casinos. So if that were a number of tribes, it would be something even narrower than 1/7. And that's because to have a successful gaming operation, you have to have customers. And so that means easy access to large populations and major transportation routes. And for reservations located in more removed areas, which is the more typical pattern, you can have casinos. They certainly provide jobs for a certain number of people. It's an enterprise that is worthwhile to have. One person once talked to me about, we didn't actually have a restaurant on the reservation until we had the casino come along, and suddenly there was enough activity that you could have a small restaurant on Indian land. So I don't want to understate the fact that casinos have contributed to circumstances in lots of places, but have not produced a kind of transformation that we have seen in a number of very small places. Now, if of course you're studying and thinking about those small places, it's very important. But in terms of painting a national picture, I think we have to think about casinos in context. So with that background in place, I want to talk a little bit about, talk more about what are the sources of effective government and effective governance for American Indian tribal governments. So if we're talking about what's this trade-off between government and governance, one question is, well, what are those ingredients, those building blocks in each of those things? And I would argue from my prior work that one of those key building blocks, both for government and for governance, is what I term institutional niches. So an institutional niche is a source of support that can provide small but meaningful subsidies for the cultivation of expertise. So where do we see roots of effective government and effective governance? It's finding sources of outside support, typically from the federal government, that don't necessarily deliver a transformation, but provide small and meaningful forms of assistance that help tribes build their own capacity, build their expertise. And when I talk about subsidies, I'm not using that purely talking about financial, but any sort of infusion of various resources. Okay, so what is that? If we break that down a little, if institutional niches are important elements of effective government and governance, what kind of benefits are deriving from these sources that aren't necessarily big benefits and yet help with building expert capacity? And I point to 3 different types of assistance that are important core elements of effective governing, government and governance on Indian lands. Aid with developing technical policy expertise, aid in getting to know the external environment, so facilitating a lot of interactions, partnerships, networks with other state and local governments, nonprofits, firms, and also providing exposure to a variety of strategies and organizational forms. So institutional niches, in particular federal supporters and federal partners, really can engage in this sharing of capacity, which results in building of tribal capacity, provide some technical assistance, provide a place in broader networks, provide some models of how organizations might work. And all of these things are activities that support program infrastructure and allow programs to generate, sustain, apply, and reproduce expertise. So expertise within an institution and organization, not simply expertise held by particular individuals. So if one of these roots of effective tribal government and governance is about certain forms of assistance from institutional niches, assistance that can, in practice, be really a lot about governance. Another question is about strategies to buttress these institutional niches. So there are opportunities for kinds of assistance. How do you stabilize and structure those sort of relationships? And I observe 3 strategies for buttressing institutional niches, for buttressing what I would call relations with powerful partners, actors who in general are more powerful than you and yet can provide a useful relationship. And what I observe in my work is I see tribal governments working to improve their access to federal officials, to alter procedures, so in ways that produce more favorable, flexible, simple, and more stable policies. And then a piece that really is about the more abstract, perhaps symbolic rules of the game, altering frameworks, a piece that is essential for self-government, but not necessarily key to the act of governance, because it is more abstract, more removed, more about stating principles. So one of these activities that I think is important and that we can observe is tribes engaging in an effort to get federal actors to do more to acknowledge tribes' importance and to endorse tribal power. What I would contend as we think about this choice about what's the strategy or strategies that tribal governments are using to improve their governing power, there's a lot in common that's pretty core to how they're going to improve their governance power and how they're going to improve their government power. Although one, I think, distinction comes from this piece of investing and changing the frameworks, which is more abstract than specifying the types of assistance you need or working to change access or procedures or how we go about pieces of daily business. So I want to say a little bit about, I want to talk about some empirics that explore these kinds of relationships and this kind of support. This is some empirics coming out of my book, and I want to walk through a little about the cases I'm examining, here's where I want to talk quickly about methods, but not too quickly that people get lost. So if I start to talk too quickly, slow me down. So in this project, I looked at tribal governments that varied by their government institutionalization and by their economic development. So by institutionalization, I tried out some pretty standard definitions, so governments with functional specialization and with differentiation of government. And by economic development, that generally takes the form of large casinos or extensive natural resources extraction. And here are the particulars using these categories of differences in government institutionalization and economy. I've got 3 regions of the country I'm looking at. And so we end up with 12 cells in the analysis. And some of these I'm going to pull out some data from today, and others would be, you got to get the book and read about them. So one piece that I evaluate is this investment in efforts to buttress federal assistance. And but here I look at the nature of tribes' communications with federal officials. So the unit of analysis being each federal interaction that a tribe experiences. And the piece that I think helps us distinguish between emphasis on government and governance is right here in terms of that investment of time, resources, and energy in altering frameworks. So this first column is ratio of communications. So how much time do you spend talking about the particular assistance you need? You need access to technical advice. You need access to a broader environment. You need access to different organizational forms and strategies versus working on changing a structure of relationship. You want to change how accesses provide, how procedures are run, how frameworks are run. So some of this is that first stage of nitty-gritty of talking about what you actually need. And so if a tribe was communicating with the federal officials exclusively about the types of aid they needed, this number would be 0. And if they were communicating more about the structure of the relationships, this would get to be a very, very large number. So what we see here in 1 would be that even point where they're spending as much time trying to deal with the nitty-gritty of aid and comparable amount of time dealing with the structure of relationship. So basically what we see here is that attention is going to the underlying structure of relationship, and at the same time, more interactions are involved in this very detailed part of the nature of assistance needed. How do we interact with federal officials over the types of technical assistance we need, the types of exposure to external environments, and the types of strategies and organizations that will be useful to us. And I think what we see is, in fact, there is more of that investment in the details of aid than in talking about the structure of a relationship. Although it is not a trivial amount of energy and time that goes into looking at the structure of a relationship. So then if we break it down into what are these pieces of structure that you're particularly attentive to, I would argue that access, trying to reevaluate forms of access, trying to have a conversation about procedures, are again this element that can feed into government and to governance. And I think this conversation about frameworks is clearly the piece that may at times seem more symbolic and less tangible. And so what's the bottom line here in terms of the lived activities of tribal governments? How much are they engaging in activities that really are exclusively about self-government? And the story is not all that much. I mean, we start with There's even more involvement in discussions about the type of aid than the discussion about the types of relationships. And in terms of talking about the types of relationships, it tends to be pretty practical and pretty tangible. If they're going to be quarterly meetings, are we going to be invited? How is it that our grant call is going to come out every 6 months or every year? So there's, in fact, very tangible pieces of talking about structure. So I think the account is that it's not that there's no attention to this piece of framework, the truly abstract part of it, and yet it's not, certainly not the driving feature of interactions. It's not even the driving feature of dialogue about structures. So as we look at a particular set of tribes for which I have some data in the form of newsletters or minutes or other documentations of daily, weekly deliberations, there is more attention in this direction of governance, or at least interactions that serve both government and serve governance. And this is a piece of analysis that is very much, opportunistic, and that I started with the particular places I was studying and went and looked at what kinds of information were available. So that meant in some cases there were information of this particular sort, which is you have access to looking at speeches. In other cases, you end up with access to federal grant applications. And so it's not a piece of triangulating, it's even more parts of it. And so this is just looking at one part of it for tribal governments where you could see extensive use of either tribal council minutes or tribal newsletters. So that continuing day-to-day documentation of what tribal governments are doing in this very consistent format over time.
Do you see any need to differentiate in the analysis among the sources?
Absolutely, yeah. And so what the book does is then looks at, as we examine these different sources, do we see central tendencies? And the short answer is yes, we do see central tendencies, although there is important variation to note as well. So this is not something that's anomalous to these particular tribes or these particular sources. There are indications in other domains that this attention to the framework, that essential piece of self-government is there, and yet it's not the all-consuming, fully motivating piece. Yeah, it's one of those cases, the research design started with picking 12 cases and just scouring what sort of information was available and drawing on that information and developing interpretations. There was another question? Yeah.
So my question is, before they have a gamble business, how do they manage their life?
You mean in terms of providing for day-to-day material?
Yeah.
So some of that is forms of federal assistance. Clearly for a lot of folks in unemployment and poverty, that involves accessing federal social services. Economic activities on reservations that precede gaming. So in some places we see varying degrees of forms of natural resources extraction. So fishing, timber, in some places that meant mining as well. And we do also see enterprises on tribal lands. I mean, there are restaurants and car repair shops and grocery stores. The frequency of those things can vary, so that's another employment opportunity. Also, you find there are many tribal members who work in adjacent communities. They're close to reservations. In fact, you find many tribal members who are living just off the reservation. So very close, but they're very socially engaged and continue to have voting power, but live just off the reservation, so they have access to jobs in Gallup, in Tulalip, in I was about to say Pierre, South Dakota, but it's Pierre. That's one thing I learned. So that's another form of economic activity. But certainly when you have that degree of poverty and unemployment, forms of federal assistance, and the trust relationship are important for just day-to-day survival. The citizenship works basically as dual citizenship. So being a member of a tribal nation contained within the United States does not impede being a citizen of the United States as well.
So it sounds like, for me, Indian nation is something like the United States, 51st states or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the analogy to state is probably the most useful. One is a citizen of California and a citizen of the United States. Being in California does not then exclude you from federal income tax or something like that. Casinos are this parallel legal development that we've seen over time. So in the late 1980s, once you stop to look at treaty language, so tribes are not subject to regulation by state governments, which means state governments' laws about taxes on tobacco or laws about things like casino operations just don't apply on Indian lands. And so then you start to see various tribes developing, especially ones who are close to metro areas on transportation routes, starting to develop bingo facilities, even more casino gaming. The federal government says we've got very competing interests of a set of sovereigns. We have sovereign tribal nations and sovereign states. And the feds create a structure where essentially states and tribes are obliged to engage in a negotiation process about what gaming powers will exist and what are the regulations about forms of essentially taxes or compensation paid to state and local governments. So any state that doesn't want to have Indian gaming, if they eliminate all forms of gambling under state law, have the ability to nullify Indian gaming within the state. But states that choose to have lotteries, other forms of gambling that are legal, then have limits on their ability to restrict tribal gaming.
Is that a consequence of a lawsuit or a federal statute? And what mechanism governs that set of priorities?
It's by and large federal statute. It's been enough of an issue that Congress has been willing to step in and pass legislation that prescribes this, as opposed to leaving it ambiguous in the courts and leaving it for the courts to interpret. It's one of those domains where it's been such a big issue and a hot issue. So that's a particular area where the federal government has said we have a set of sovereigns, tribal nations and states, that have this contentious and important area of conflict. And so the federal government sets some rules of the game of how these sovereigns interact with each other. So it's a very separate, unique, yet clearly important issue for tribes that have been able to access significant casino revenues.
I wonder can you give a concrete example of what constitutes an interaction? So is someone from the tribe talking to a federal official in an office setting? So what is, in your definition, what is an interaction?
Yeah, it could be having a conversation. It could be sending a correspondence. Some form of communication. Right, and the various...
Tell from reading the newspaper. So the newspaper has a report about a communication with a federal official that you can...
Yeah, that's a very large part. I mean, there's the coverage of the local sports team, and there's the coverage of social events going on, and the coverage of, recipes, the sorts of thing we'd see in any kind of local newspaper. But there's a lot of discussion of the activities of tribal government. What exactly we've been doing, any particular departments does these. Well, in the past 3 months, we've done this, 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 this. And then 3 months later, they say, well, so there's a lot of cataloging of the activities of government. Clearly, and then some of this is coming from the tribal councils tend to keep minutes of their activities and require regular reports from agencies. And some tribes have made these council minutes public records. And there you can go through and get more details about the nature of interactions. So I don't want to oversell this this source of data and that it's one in a process that requires not just triangulation, but analysis from a variety of sources. So I then want to talk through some examples because we can look at summary statistics, but it's useful to think through lived experiences. And I want to start with one example of a perspective on this choice of trade-offs, again coming from the National Congress of American Indians, this time from the president of the organization, with the argument that governance is important, but ultimately government needs to precede and complement it. And so what the president states, and this is a letter to, a report to, I think it's the Department of Interior, the Secretary of the Department of Interior, about the conduct of the tribal-state relationship. And so the letter says, I'm exerting parts because it's a lengthy letter, but the letter says, far too many federal officials are totally ignorant of the most basic protocols which should govern such a relationship. An executive order providing such simple and direct guidance to all federal officials to provide Indian tribes due process, notice of federal actions impacting trust properties, and basic respect for the rights of self-government will be truly historic. Then goes on to provide more particular applications. For natural resources policy, we ask that our tribal governments have a seat at the table as federal resource management decisions are made. Further, we seek your support for the rights of Indian tribes to exercise primary jurisdiction over natural resource management within the boundaries of our reservations. So the president of the National Congress of American Indians is starting here with, we need to start by thinking about this framework of the government, federal government's relationship with the government of tribal governments, and what it means to have a structure in place that acknowledges and respects that relationship. And you can even think, it's sometimes when you read documents that people are writing, you can look at trade-offs in terms of allocation of FTE, you can look at it in terms of funding, you can also look, someone's got a 2-page memo to write and how much space do they devote to it. And so it's telling in this particular case, it's a very short memo, and yet that first page is coming out to be about this idea of government to government relationship. So if the federal official reading it gets a little tired or spills a sandwich on the second page, what they've gotten is this piece about the importance of government. And yet, the discussion then does proceed to some questions of more about governance, and that what they're asking for is, let's have a seat at the table in federal resource management decisions. Now that's then followed by recognizing sovereignty and primary jurisdiction, but a piece that certainly the president of the National Congress of American Indians invokes is that this piece of partnership, of shared communication, of having some shared decision making is also very important in meeting the needs of Indian nations. So it's not a memo that when you read that second page, you realize there's actually a transition to caring quite a lot about governance along with government. Another particular example, and this is coming from the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, that gives great value to governance and at the same time sees self-government as an apex to pursue. And so we start with a case in 1995 where there's a vaunting of a great new initiative that results in collaborative governance. And so to quote Billy Frank Jr., who's the chairman of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, this new arrangement, the For the Sake of the Salmon Charter, is potentially the most far-reaching, comprehensive, cooperative commitment to salmon restoration and protection to come along in many years. This is actually coming out of, so in the quarterly publications of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, Frank writes, a one-page on what's the big issues going on. And this is a case where this is an issue he highlights. And what is happening in the For the Sake of the Salmon Charter is a very familiar model of, or comparable model of a collaborative governance activity. So the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is a federal agency, is going to, for all stakeholders, for tribes, for states, for localities, for firms, for private agricultural landowners, is going to facilitate dialogue and technical assistance. It's going to provide scientific assessments that are then a baseline for a conversation, and also financial incentive for landowners who are going to be adversely impacted by any regulations of land activity that matter for salmon health. Basically, you have any sort of runoff of land, and that can include, for example, pesticide use gets into the water. Pesticides are bad for fish, not just for fruit flies or whatnot. Yeah, humans too, not so hot for humans as well. So clearly in 1995, there's a great appreciation of an act of collaborative governance. What's being valued here is the federal government's bringing a lot of actors together, providing support for all of them to engage in identifying joint needs and joint negotiation. And yet, 2 years later, Frank is giving even greater attention to efforts at buttressing tribal government, not just questions of governance. And this is something he highlights as the next great accomplishment. So you started with exercise of governance, and then the piece that is to be valued after that is in the next step of building on those powers is a case of the federal government acknowledging a government relationship. So, sorry, I have to remember to keep changing these on both devices. So there's a federal secretarial order, not quite the same as providing financial compensation to landowners or providing everybody with regular data on how the fish are doing, but a federal secretarial order that acknowledges key powers of Indian nations and that states the federal government will give deference to tribal conservation and management plans for tribal trust resources that govern activities on Indian lands. And Frank describes this as the culmination of a year-long effort involving tribes from across the United States. And so governance being important, but the step that is seen as the natural progression and the greater accomplishment is the secretarial order that provides this very abstract structuring that is about self-government. Okay, so for time, I want to talk a little bit about, so as tribal governments engage in these negotiations with federal agencies, either about governance powers or government power, there is the question of how is it that tribes get federal officials to come to the table at all? And one side is about the benefits of partnership and collaboration, that when agencies are involved in tribes' activities, they can claim success when these programs succeed. And on the other side, that tribal leaders can then go testify before Congress and legislatures about the accomplishments of agencies, because agencies aren't allowed to lobby Congress. And so this partner can become a valuable voice for federal agencies in forming this sort of partnership. So the nature of shared incentives, mutual benefit in a collaboration are clearly an important element. And yet at the same time, if that benefit of partnership is the carrot or the inducement, we see that self-government is an important hammer at moments where these opportunities to cooperate don't emerge in the same way. So one is that tribal sovereignty provides opportunities for allies. That means because tribal governments have government powers, they can do stuff that maybe counties or cities can't do. And so self-government, by increasing tribal power, makes them an even more enticing partner. And also tribal sovereignty enables forms of reprisal. If federal agencies if relationships with federal agencies have been more conflictual than cooperative, this base of government power then provides a way to impose sanctions, induce difficulties for those agencies. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit of that. I can come back to say more about those particular points. Oh, okay, I'm forgetting to change slides. So, partnerships about chances to claim credit, chances to back each other before Congress, self-government important of being an attractive ally and be able to engage in reprisals. What can we then learn from looking at the circumstances of indigenous peoples abroad? And this is a question I had a chance to reflect on in writing this piece for the annual review, and started with but things have got to be so different within the Anglosphere, and discovering that in fact there's some very insightful sources of leverage that we can get from the international comparison. And this is just something I silly to say, I didn't even know before I did this work, is that in large swaths of Canada, Native nations have governance without sovereignty. So as we think of essentially Plains tribes in Canada, there are treaty agreements to a degree comparable to in the United States, same as in the Canadian Great Lakes as well. But when you move to British Columbia, or all those northern territories, so the Yukon, Northern Territory, and Nunavut, there was an absence of historical treaties. So there is no historical treaty arrangement to structure relationships. And so what the Canadian government has done, so the Canadian courts have said, the decision from the Supreme Court is that, series of decisions is that the Canadian government has to be engaged in a process of trying to negotiate treaties with Native nations within Canada that don't have treaties. They need to come to the table and engage in a process. Well, when you drag any federal agency to the table to negotiate and they don't want to do it, what happens? We've seen a process that's slow, laborious, and often unsuccessful. So treaties emerging after 20 or more years of negotiation. So there have been a number of Native nations in Canada who entered this treaty-making process and at some point said this is consuming a tremendous amount of resources and it doesn't look like it's going to result in a treaty that meets our needs, or tribes that continue to be involved in that effort and see lots of energy and effort going to something that's moving slowly with an uncertain fate. So here in Canada, as a result, we have a chance to think about governance as a tool on its own. So in certain places where in reality self-government in the form we see in the US is not on the table. So then how does governance operate in that circumstance? Well, one concern is that the Canadian government has been very eager to establish various forms of shared governance agreements with Native nations throughout Canada, and particularly in British Columbia and Canada's north. And in many ways, these are explicitly and implicitly framed as substitutes for treaty arrangements. This is easier for us to get to. And so these cooperative agreements cover a range of areas. They involve cooperative management and decision-making about social service delivery, and then cooperative land management activities. And the body of research from Canada is that many Native leaders see these cooperative arrangements as delivering productive outcomes and at the same time being an unfortunate compromise. So feeling as if government was the ideal, but in terms of what the Canadian government's going to put on the table, governance is the necessary compromise to make. But then we get this interesting complication in Canada's north that there is a certain degree of self-government that comes from power in other political processes. So in Canada's north, Native peoples are a sizable share of the electorate. And there are Native elected officials and a great deal of Native elective power in Yukon Territory, the Northern Territory, and Nunavut, as well as in local governments in those places as well. And so what's happened is we have not seen treaties that allow for self-government, and yet we have seen powers of government held by Native officials that have resulted in another layer of supervising these cooperative agreements. And so again, in the work that has interviewed Native leaders in the Canadian North, what these leaders have stated is that having this electoral power, in fact, does improve their satisfaction with these cooperative relationships. Having that level of elected officials with clear electoral powers is a useful resource for keeping actors in a cooperative relationship in line, keeping a conversation focused in a certain way. And so I think the implication is that in Canada, governance has been a source of opportunities for Native nations. In many cases, it's seen as an unfortunate compromise because it's not the full ideal. And yet there is this in-between status of what it means to have political power within the mainstream political institutions of Canada.
So maybe, could I ask a question?
Yeah.
So given the Canadian experience, I was wondering in the US, would some of those tribal governments be kind of dictatorial, sort of dominated by some strong man, or, is that a common problem in the US? Sort of tribal democracy.
Yeah. So it's a huge question. So the basic answer is the Bureau of Indian Affairs provides a level of supervision of political and electoral activities on reservations. Just like the federal government would provide supervision to a degree of democratic practices in states and voting rights and civil rights and adherence to the constitutional amendments that regulate all sovereigns within the United States. At the same time, in some places there are huge problems of cronyism and patronage and divisiveness that really is about family, conflict between families. It's a huge issue in a lot of places. There's some folks with the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. They're doing some great work on this, talking about building government institutions that are aligned with cultural traditions and with norms. So one of the big problems is, starting in the 1930s, federal government said, we're going to create self-governments, and here's how that government's going to operate. Plop down a way of organizing your government, which has problematic implications. So in some places, either that forum aligned pretty well with underlying cultural practices and norms. In other cases, there happened to be leadership at the right moment who then guided those institutional arrangements in other ways. And in other places, as the Harvard Project has done a compelling job of illustrating, we've seen these government institutions that just don't match society and norms. And as a result, you've ended up with a lot of problems of cronyism and patronage and family conflict. It's been tough too with, you've seen this in California when you have very small tribes with 300 people. Well, everybody's got this layer of personal relation. Everybody's cousin or aunt or uncle, and so then it's very difficult for government to have this differentiation, this separation from society. It's just a very difficult challenge that is faced. So yeah, I think having the authority to exercise self-government doesn't always improve the welfare of people's lives. It's not a panacea. So the next piece, which I think is an even more extreme example of how does governance work when government is off the table, is that Australia has had a very different historical experience. So treaties were never signed in Australia. The undergirding legal principle in Australia has been that of terra nullius, which means that there was no ownership of land when British and European settlers landed, so it was there for the takings. Whoever claimed it had full rights to those lands. And as a result, there was no concept of sovereignty because there was no established land base that was governed by native peoples. So it's an even more extreme example where government and sovereignty throughout the bulk of Australian history has just been off the table. And the question then becomes this piece of governance, which is more fluid and more more flexible. And we've seen some pretty amazing things happen out in recent decades out of what looks like a system where indigenous power is going to be quite limited. So we really can start to see changes with, in the 60s and 70s with pronounced increase in indigenous political protest and political activism. So a lot of observing lessons from the civil rights movement in the United States, as well as the Red Power movement in the 1970s, advocating for Indian rights. So people might remember the standoff at Wounded Knee, or the occupation of Alcatraz, or the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs offices. That may be taking some of you in the Wayback Machine. But there were forms of protest and activism where the lessons were observed around the world, and we see a marked increase in this protest and activism and really consciousness raising by indigenous peoples in Australia. And this even for peoples without any recognition of sovereignty, in a circumstance where land rights are defined terra nullius, whoever was there and claimed it has full rights to that land, we actually start to see some surprising accommodation by the Australian government in response to these forms of very visible political activism, which generate public sympathies to an important degree. So the first thing we see is the Australian government actually starts to take some big steps towards collaborative governance, in that it allows indigenous communities to form legally standing corporate bodies, which then will play a role in managing local places, managing social services, and managing land. So it's not sovereignty, it's not exclusive, enduring, inherent powers, and yet it's a very big change. And a lot of scholars argue that, in fact, creating this opportunity allows for this chance to build expertise, and you build capacity, and you build savvy, and you build further ability to organize. And so it becomes a stepping stone for greater power. This chance, this first foot in the door about collaborative governance, becomes a tool for both political participation and for greater role in governance. And one implication we see there is that Canada and Australia both have northern territories, very different climates. Australians is in deserts and tropics. But we see within the Northern Territory, where a sizable share of the population is indigenous, we start to see indigenous elected officials at the level of the territorial government and local government. And this builds on the participation in mainstream political institutions and this experience of shared management, of capacity building, that voting rights are protected and maintained, and the ability to engage in coalitions and negotiations with other elected officials increases as well, mounting campaigns and winning elections. And the piece that has also come along was a set of court decisions in the 1990s which actually acknowledged there were forms of enduring native title, which is hard to overstate what a kind of huge change that is. This is, again, not sovereignty, not about self-governments, but in a legal system that had been based on this idea of terra nullius, to say that at least in some circumstances, there is native title that has endured over time, and there are rights to collective land ownership and land management, was actually a very important change. And there's some indication that these decisions did have an eye to the awareness of what was actually happening with land management in the past couple decades, and that we saw greater capacity and greater partnerships that lended credence and legitimacy to the idea that indigenous peoples in Australia could self-regulate. This wasn't some sort of abstract idea. People could turn to lived experience. So again, in this situation where political power seems pretty weak, in fact, some forms of political activism can generate powers of governance, and then those powers of governance can then feed back into activities that look a lot closer to self-government than one saw in Australia for a very long time. So how do we think about, is there this trade-off between government and governance? I think maybe the suggestion I would offer is that maybe at times, but ultimately the two support each other, and sometimes there's not a trade-off. Strong governance makes strong governments, and vice versa. There are times when a sacrifice has to be made, but I think the lesson about collaborative governance is it has these spillover advantages, and at the same time, government and governmental power is an important resource for making effective collaborative governance. And then the Canadian and Australian examples, because essentially we see these cases where sovereignty is pretty much off the table, we have this chance to observe how political power on its own is an important resource for Native peoples. And so that the story of what is government maybe isn't quite so simple as having tribal self-governments, but maybe we should appreciate more what power in elected office brings. So for me, this raises a couple of broader questions. One is we think about marginalized groups that don't necessarily have a foundation of political power, either an independent power or power in mainstream legislative institutions. What does that mean for activities of shared governance? Essentially working with powerful partners like federal and state agencies. I don't want to suggest that there's an answer here because I'm trying to draw on implications from various pieces of literature and empirics. But I think it does raise, for me, it raises a question that I would be interested in hearing more about, of what exactly, how is, I think this work raises some questions about what are the experiences of marginalized groups and how government and governance play off. And here's my piece about encouraging people who are studying California. So this is why being weird is good on all sorts of levels. But here one is that because we've seen such an extensive growth of gaming in California, it provides a case where we've seen this big change, if we go back between the 90s and now, in the political power of tribal governments, where that power was basically zero before the growth of gaming, and over time has increased markedly. And it'd be awfully interesting to understand how governance and collaborative governance are working for those tribal governments. We have a really interesting literature that's becoming more robust about the legislative power that gaming tribes have built. Both, you guys have seen it through the initiative process and through the legislature. And clearly there is a important, powerful legislative role that has been developed by gaming tribes in California. But we don't know a lot about how collaborative governance is playing out in those places, how governance as a broader matter is playing out, and how those two factors interplay. And so I think y'all have right around you an excellent opportunity to think about that interplay between government and governance. So I'm going to go back to my original quote that has been bouncing around in my head for a long time. And I would suggest that I want to take this idea very seriously, that maybe a starting point is government to government, even if that means less time and energy and activities of governance. And at the same time being aware that there might be opportunities to not make government and governance be in competition, but the two can support and nurture each other. So I would love to hear questions or comments or, yeah.
So I understand that in law, the extent of sovereignty given to the tribal governments might be greater than that to state governments. But in practice, I think I wonder how different the tribal governments and state governments are in practice in terms of dealing with policy issues and funding issues with the federal government.
Yeah, well, and some of that, right, in terms of lived economic and political power, those things matter. And so that's even if the legal status is remarkably similar, although not entirely, that lived experience, I think, as we look at the difference between how tribal governments are treated in states, I think it's more so about that underlying practical power than the differences in the legal arrangements. And so then how, oh yeah, go ahead.
Go back to your sort of the definition of sovereignty. So can a tribal government enact something that is against the U.S. Constitution? Can they do that?
No. So, so
then
sovereignty can be within limited domains.
limited domains. What are the limited domains?
Well, so limited domains of not being able to redefine voting rights, not being able to redefine the writ of habeas corpus.
Okay, there are limitations to what they can.
Right. So there are.
So that is specific to the treaty.
Right. So John Marshall in the 1830s talked about this as domestic dependent nations. So having nationhood and yet having features of being domestic and dependent. The idea that these two pieces fit together. I mean, there are domains of sovereignty and clearly domains where sovereignty has been surrendered. You know, it's interesting, a lot of folks have just been working on the acknowledging a government-to-government relationship. And a number of tribes have worked on this and succeeded in getting states to enact official government-to-government relationships, and then engaging in activities to hold agencies to that criteria. So I think partly it involves a statement as well as an enforcement process. There's a lot of, in terms of frameworks, and we'll see how much those frameworks pay off. So the White House has just created a White House Executive Office of the President level agency to coordinate tribal affairs, moving more negotiations out of agencies and out of frontline bureaucrats.
So there's a seat at the table, really, right?
And a higher status, so I don't have to negotiate with, you know, someone, SES 12 or something like that. But because it's a government relationship, I have a relationship directly to the Executive Office of the President.
One last question. I think we're running out of time. Any last question? I guess that's it. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.